They were more than friends. They were creative soulmates who changed the world. A bond so powerful it felt like two halves of a single genius finding each other in the backstreets of Liverpool. Their names were John Lennon and Paul McCartney, and their partnership fueled the greatest cultural phenomenon in modern history. But behind the music, a poison was spreading. It was a slow-acting venom of ego, money, and personal betrayals that would eventually curdle their profound love into something unrecognizable. In the bitter years after the Beatles imploded, Paul McCartney would be pushed to a level of anger he'd never known, fueled by one man's relentless and cruel public attacks. This wasn't a disagreement. It was a war fought in headlines and on vinyl. It was a deep, searing animosity that led McCartney to feel a fury he had never experienced before, or since. This is the story of how the most celebrated partnership in music history disintegrated into a vicious feud that left one of them admitting to a pain that was deeply personal, and the other holding the weapon that inflicted the deepest wounds. This is the story of how love and friendship were weaponized, tearing the Beatles apart for good. The animosity became so palpable, so public, it threatened to overshadow their legendary music. In the aftermath of the band's collapse, Paul McCartney found himself the target of a series of brutal public character assassinations. His former partner, his creative other half, was now his chief tormentor. In his book, The Lyrics 1956 to the Present, McCartney recalls the shock of this sudden turn. When we broke up and everyone was now flailing around, John turned nasty. McCartney writes, I don't really understand why. Maybe because we grew up in Liverpool where it was always good to get in the first punch of a fight. John was firing missiles at me with his songs and one or two of them were quite cruel. McCartney confessed his reaction was a mix of rage and genuine pain. So, I'm having to read all this stuff and on the one hand I'm thinking, oh off, you f***ing idiot, he stated. But on the other hand I'm thinking, why would you say that? It was a question that haunted him. How did the man he wrote Yesterday with, the man who was like a brother, become the source of such intense, personal pain? To understand the feud, you have to first understand the love that came before it. Before the bitterness, before the lawsuits and the diss tracks, there was just John and Paul. Their story starts not in a boardroom, but on a church fete stage in Liverpool in 1957. It was a connection born from a shared tragedy and a shared passion. Both had lost their mothers young, Paul's to cancer when he was 14, John's in a traffic accident. It was a devastating common ground that forged an unspoken, intimate bond between two teenagers who, on the surface, seemed like total opposites. Paul was the melodic prodigy, meticulously crafted and musically adept. John was the raw, rebellious spirit, the sharp-witted rocker with a cynical edge. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts. They famously wrote their songs eyeball to eyeball. It was an intense creative conversation where one would start a line and the other would finish it. They pushed, challenged, and completed each other. As McCartney told Rolling Stone in 2016, John and me, we were kids growing up together. We were on the same escalator. On the same step of the escalator all the way, it's irreplaceable. That time, friendship and bonding. This was the bedrock of the Beatles. While George Harrison's intricate guitar and Ringo Starr's intuitive drumming were essential, the Lennon-McCartney partnership was the sun that the entire Beatles universe revolved around. They were a unit, a self-contained world of in-jokes and mutual understanding. This intimacy was a kind of platonic romance, where the depth of feeling was both dynamic and at times volatile. They saw each other not just as bandmates, but as extensions of themselves. This profound connection made their creative output extraordinary, but it also laid the groundwork for an equally extraordinary collapse. When a bond is that intense, the fallout from its fracture is destined to be just as powerful. The love they shared was the kind that could conquer the world. But as they would discover, it was also the kind that could curdle into a uniquely painful form of hate. The end of the Beatles wasn't one single event, but a slow, agonizing decay. The first major crack appeared on August 27, 1967. That was the day their manager, Brian Epstein, was found dead from an accidental overdose. Epstein was more than their manager. He was their mediator, their father figure, the glue that held them together. He handled the messy business, smoothed over disagreements, and let them focus on the music. With his death, the band lost its rudder. Into the power vacuum stepped Paul McCartney. Ever the pragmatist, he was driven by a desperate need to keep the band moving forward. He tried to rally the troops, pushing them into new projects like the Magical Mystery Tour film. But what Paul saw as necessary leadership, the others, especially John, saw as bossiness. The dynamic had shifted. The made-for-TV film, largely driven by Paul, was their first real critical failure, savaged by reviewers after its Boxing Day broadcast. While the accompanying soundtrack was a commercial and critical success, the film's poor reception laid the blame, fair or not, at Paul's feet. The four-headed monster was starting to pull in different directions. Then came Yoko Ono. Now it's a massive oversimplification to blame Yoko for the breakup, a narrative McCartney himself has corrected. The issue wasn't Yoko, but how her relationship with John fundamentally altered the band's chemistry. For years, the core unit was John and Paul. Suddenly, John had a new partner, not just in life, but in the studio. Yoko's constant presence during recording sessions was a breach of an unspoken code. The sacred space was now occupied by a fifth person. This was deeply unsettling for Paul, who felt his lifelong partner drifting away. Lennon later cemented this, famously stating, "I'm John and Yoko." This new alliance left Paul on the outside, looking in, a position he'd never been in before. The sound of this fragmentation was their 1968 double album, known as the White Album. It wasn't a collaborative effort so much as four solo artists recording under one roof. The sessions were tense, arguments were common. John's avant-garde tendencies, encouraged by Yoko, clashed with Paul's pop sensibilities. George Harrison, long overshadowed by Lennon-McCartney, grew frustrated with Paul's controlling direction over his songs, feeling his own work wasn't getting the respect it deserved. At one point, Ringo Starr briefly quit, feeling like an outsider. The family was breaking down, and the music, once a source of unity, was now a battlefield. If personal tensions were cracks, business disputes were the earthquake that brought the whole thing down. After Brian Epstein's death, the Beatles' financial affairs were a mess. Their company, Apple Corps, was bleeding money. They needed a new manager, and this is where the final, fatal split happened. Paul wanted his father-in-law and brother-in-law, Lee and John Eastman, respected New York entertainment lawyers. To Paul, they were family. To the other three, it was a conflict of interest, fearing the Eastmans would prioritize Paul. Into this climate of suspicion walked Alan Klein. Klein was a notoriously aggressive American manager who represented the Rolling Stones. He was a street fighter, and John Lennon was immediately impressed. Klein spoke John's language, anti-establishment and focused on money. Soon, George and Ringo were on board. They saw Klein as their champion, while viewing the Eastmans as suits, who just represented Paul. The battle lines were drawn, Paul versus John, George, Ringo, and Alan Klein. Paul felt utterly betrayed. He couldn't understand how the others could trust this outsider he considered a shark. They saw Paul's insistence on the Eastmans as just another attempt to control them. The final blow came in September 1969. During a meeting, Paul suggested, "They go back to their roots, play small clubs, and remember why they started." John's response was cold and final. As McCartney recalled, John's actual words were, "I think you're daft. And I wasn't going to tell you. I'm breaking the group up." He said, "It feels good. It feels like a divorce." At Klein's insistence, who was negotiating a new contract, the breakup was kept secret. Paul was devastated. He retreated to his farm in Scotland with his family and fell into a deep depression. He felt trapped. The band was over, but he was still legally bound to it, with its finances controlled by a man he despised. To free himself, Paul felt he had only one option. On December 31, 1970, he filed a lawsuit against the other three Beatles and Apple Corps to formally dissolve the partnership. To the public, Paul was cast as the villain who broke up the Beatles. For Paul, it was an act of desperation. the only way to escape a situation that was destroying him. The divorce was no longer a secret. It was a public declaration of war. With the partnership shattered, the battlefield shifted to the recording studio. Paul, feeling attacked and isolated, fired the first subtle shot on his 1971 album, Ram. On the track Too Many People, he took aim at what he saw as John and Yoko's hypocritical preaching. The lyrics, "Too many people preaching practices," and "that was your first mistake, you took your lucky break and broke it in two," were clear jabs. John heard them loud and clear, and his response would be anything but subtle. It would be nuclear. Lennon's retaliation came on his 1971 album, Imagine. The song was How Do You Sleep, and it was one of the most vicious musical attacks in rock history. It wasn't just a song, it was a character assassination. To make it even crueler, he invited George Harrison to play slide guitar on the track. George, still nursing his own resentments, agreed. For Paul, hearing his two former bandmates, his brothers, collaborate on this musical assault must have felt like a profound betrayal. The lyrics of How Do You Sleep were a line-by-line dismantling of Paul's legacy. Lennon sneered, "So Sgt. Pepper took you by surprise," and dredged up the Paul is dead conspiracy with, "Those freaks was right when they said you was dead." But the most infamous and hurtful line was a direct dismissal of Paul's entire contribution. "The only thing you done was yesterday, and since you've gone, you're just another day." To suggest the co-writer of Hey Jude and Let It Be had done nothing of value besides one early ballad was an act of profound artistic cruelty. Lennon even called Paul's music "Muzak to my ears." Paul was deeply wounded. "I had to work very hard not to take it too seriously," he later said. "But at the back of my mind I was thinking, wait a minute, all I ever did was yesterday." He added, "I suppose that's a funny pun, but all I ever did was let it be. The Long and Winding Road, Eleanor Rigby, Lady Madonna." Fuck you, John. He felt John's attacks were relentless and nonsensical. John would say things like, "It was rubbish. The Beatles were crap." Those were quite hurtful barbs to be flinging around, and I was the person they were being flung at. And it hurt. This was the pinnacle of John's nasty turn. The war of words was at its peak, but song lyrics were only part of the battle. The fight spilled into the public press, with even more personal and scathing attacks delivered in print. But before we get to the infamous open letter that laid the animosity bare, if you're finding this story of a friendship's tragic collapse fascinating, consider subscribing for more deep dives into music history. The ink on How Do You Sleep was barely dry when the feud escalated to open warfare in the pages of the British music press. In November 1971, Melody Maker published an interview with Paul, where he complained about the ongoing business disputes. "Everybody thinks I am the aggressor, but I'm not, you know. I just want out," McCartney stated. John, reading this in New York, was enraged. He felt Paul was playing the victim. His response was a furious 3-page typed letter, which he sent to Melody Maker for publication, demanding equal time. Dated November 24, 1971, it's perhaps the most raw and unfiltered document of their animosity. It was a blistering takedown of Paul and his wife Linda. Lennon began with dripping sarcasm, addressing it to "Dear Paul, Linda et al. The wee McCartneys." He attacked Paul's public persona, writing, "It's all very well playing simple, honest, ol' as human Paul and the Melody Maker, but you know damn well we can't just sign a bit of paper." He then turned his fury on Linda, who had also criticized him, telling her to shut up, let Paul write, or whatever. The letter was a torrent of accusations. John accused Paul of hypocrisy, of hurting Yoko, and of being creatively insecure. He bristled at Paul's perceived dismissal of Imagine, retorting, "So you think Imagine ain't political? It's working class here with sugar on it for conservatives like yourself." He demanded, "If you're not the aggressor, as you claim, who the hell took us to court and signs all over us in public?" But the most telling part was Lennon's reinforcement of his new alliance. He expressed puzzlement at Paul's suggestion they meet without their wives, writing, "I thought you'd have understood by now that I'm John and Yoko." Though the letter ended with a slightly softer postscript, No hard feelings to you either. Whenever you want to meet, all you have to do is call. The damage was done. The most intimate partnership of a generation had been reduced to a public spectacle of name-calling. For Paul, this was a profound humiliation. The man he had conquered the world with was now airing their dirtiest laundry for all to see. After the public bloodletting of 1971, the fury began to subside, replaced by a slow, cautious thaw. The intense anger, born from the trauma of the breakup, simply couldn't be sustained. Phone calls started to replace public letters. The conversations were tentative, but gradually the old familiarity returned. A famous story illustrates this perfectly. In April 1976, Lorne Michaels went on Saturday Night Live and jokingly offered the Beatles $3,000 to reunite on the show. As fate would have it, Paul was visiting John at his apartment in the Dakota Building that night. They were watching the show together. They looked at each other and actually considered it, just taking a cab downtown and shocking the world. They decided against it, but the fact that they shared that moment, that they could laugh about the absurdity of it all, spoke volumes. The ice was broken. Their last conversations weren't about music or money. They were about baking bread and raising kids. I would make calls to John occasionally, Paul recalled. We just talked kids and baking bread. They had found a new, quieter relationship. Paul spoke of his immense relief at this reconciliation. I was very glad of how we got along in those last few years. It would have been the worst thing in the world for me had he been killed when we still had a bad relationship. I would have thought, oh, I should have. It would have been a big guilt trip for me. That terrible what if became a tragic reality on December 8, 1980. John Lennon was murdered outside that same Dakota apartment building. The news was a seismic shock to the world, but for Paul, it was an unimaginable personal devastation. The slow reconciliation was abruptly and irrevocably frozen. There would be no more calls, no more talk of baking bread, no more chances to fully heal the wounds. When swarmed by reporters, a visibly stunned McCartney could only muster the words, "It's a drag, isn't it?" The comment, for which he was heavily criticized, was a mask for a grief so profound it couldn't yet be articulated. His partner was gone. The story of John Lennon and Paul McCartney is a story of dualities, love and hate, creation and destruction. The hate Paul McCartney felt for John Lennon wasn't simple animosity. It was a far more complex and painful emotion, the kind that can only be born from a deep and fractured love. It was the anger of a brother feeling abandoned, the fury of a partner feeling betrayed, and the profound hurt of an artist whose life's work was being denigrated by the one person whose opinion mattered most. The viciousness of Lennon's attacks, in songs and letters, was a direct measure of the intimacy they once shared. He knew exactly how to wound Paul because he knew him better than anyone, but that period of intense conflict was just one chapter in a much longer story. The eventual reconciliation, though cut tragically short, proved that the foundational bond was stronger than the bitterness that had temporarily overwhelmed it. They found their way back to each other, not as global icons, but as friends. In the decades since John's death, Paul's reflections have been tinged not with anger, but with a profound sense of loss and an enduring love. He has spoken of dreaming, about John, of still using him as a creative sounding board in his mind. The animosity, as intense as it was temporary. It was a fire that raged hot in the wreckage of their shared world but eventually burned itself out. What remains is the legacy of their partnership and the poignant reality of a friendship that, despite everything, was ultimately mended. The love, it turned out, was the thing that lasted. It was the final chord in their epic, unfinished symphony,